The night they decided I was unwanted, it happened in a living room full of people who had eaten my food for years. We were standing near the dining table, half-empty glasses, the television muted but still glowing. Ethan cleared his throat the way he always did when he wanted attention without asking for it. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "Claire's been struggling lately," he said. "With my mom, with responsibility." The word struggling landed softly. That was intentional. It gave everyone permission to nod. Margaret sat in her wheelchair by the window, a blanket folded carefully over her legs. She didn't look fragile. She looked prepared. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers interlaced, as if she were waiting for a verdict she already knew. Ethan continued, "I just think it's important to say this out loud. My mother needs support. And sometimes," he paused, "sometimes I feel like I'm alone in that." He finally turned toward me then. Every face in the room followed. No one asked me anything. No one wondered what alone actually meant in a house I managed, cleaned, funded, and emotionally buffered for 4 years. Margaret tilted her head. "I know Claire tries," she said gently, "but some people just aren't built for family." It was said kindly. That was the sharpest part. I felt the familiar instinct rise, the one that told me to explain, to clarify, to rescue myself with details. If you were in my situation, you'd recognize that moment, the moment where you realize the story has already been agreed upon. So I didn't speak. Silence makes people uncomfortable when they're expecting defense. Ethan filled it. "No one's attacking you," he said quickly, which told me exactly what this was. I watched his sister shift in her seat. I noticed how Margaret's caregiver avoided my eyes. I registered, calmly, how no one asked why Ethan's mother's expenses had doubled in a year, or why her medical equipment invoices came through my email. I nodded once. Not agreement, acknowledgement. "I understand," I said. That surprised them. Ethan blinked. Margaret's mouth tightened, just briefly. She hadn't expected compliance. She had expected resistance. Resistance was something she knew how to manage. I excused myself to the kitchen. As I passed the side table, my eyes caught on a manila folder tucked beneath a stack of mail. My name was typed on the label. Not written. Typed. That was unusual. I didn't touch it. I didn't slow down. But I saw enough to recognize the header of a financial services firm I'd never contacted. In the kitchen, I poured myself water. My hands were steady. That mattered to me. Behind me, conversation resumed. Quieter now. Satisfied. I leaned against the counter and listened. Not to words, but to tone. The relief in Ethan's voice, the reassurance in Margaret's. They thought this moment had settled something. What they didn't realize, what none of them noticed, was that for the first time in years, I wasn't trying to hold the family together. I was observing it. I looked at my reflection in the darkened microwave door. I didn't look angry. I didn't look broken. I looked alert. When I returned to the living room, no one mentioned the folder. No one mentioned what had just happened. That, too, told me something. The night ended politely. Hugs. Careful smiles. Margaret patted my hand and said, "We all do our best." I agreed again. Later, alone in the bedroom, I lay awake thinking about that folder, about my name typed where my signature should have been, about how comfortable everyone had seemed deciding my value without my input. I didn't feel hurt. I felt clear. And clarity, I would soon learn, is dangerous to people who rely on your silence. If you feel drawn to quiet strength, to stories where truth doesn't shout but still wins, you may want to stay with this one. If the story moves you, you're welcome to like and subscribe. It helps these stories find the people who need them. And if you're listening somewhere right now, tell me which city you're in. I read every comment. This story is worth listening to. Every moment of it. Now, let me take you back. Back to a time when I still believed my life was ordinary, before I understood what silence was costing me, and before I realized who, in that house, was already being pushed out. When I married Ethan, people said I was lucky. He was steady, predictable, a man who showed up on time and paid his bills. His mother, Margaret, had been in a wheelchair since a spinal injury years before I met them. That fact explained everything. people said. The closeness, the devotion, the way her needs quietly shaped every decision. At first, I respected it. We moved into a modest house 10 minutes from the rehab center Margaret visited twice a week. It made sense. Ethan said it would only be temporary, just until we figured things out. I believed him because believing him was easier than asking what figuring things out actually meant. The first year passed without incident. I adjusted my schedule to drive Margaret to appointments when the caregiver was unavailable. I learned which medications needed refills and which paperwork delayed approvals. Ethan thanked me, not often, but enough to make it feel acknowledged. Then the tone changed. Not suddenly, gradually, like a room cooling 1 degree at a time. Ethan stopped asking if I could help and started assuming I would. Margaret stopped saying please. If I forgot something, a call, a form, a detail, she didn't correct me. She remembered it. Later, in front of others. "Oh, Claire handles those things," she'd say, when she remembers. People laughed softly. I smiled. I learned to smile quickly. By the second year, I was managing the household finances. It wasn't framed as control, it was framed as trust. Ethan said he wasn't good with details. Margaret said it eased her mind knowing I was organized. Bills came to my email. Insurance correspondents addressed me by name. I noticed charges I didn't recognize, but when I asked, Ethan waved it off. Medical equipment, specialist consultations, care adjustments. "You wouldn't understand," he said once. Not cruelly, casually. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. I worked full-time. I came home and cooked meals suited to Margaret's dietary needs. I adjusted furniture so her wheelchair could move freely. I learned which moods to anticipate, which topics to avoid. I didn't feel abused. That word never crossed my mind. I felt managed. There's a difference. Abuse demands reaction. Management relies on compliance. By the third year, my role was defined without discussion. If Margaret needed something, Ethan looked at me. If Ethan felt overwhelmed, he reminded me of her condition. Everything became connected to her fragility, even when the issue had nothing to do with it. If you were in my situation, you might recognize how easy it is to confuse endurance with loyalty. Extended family visited on holidays. They praised me. "You're so good with her." Ethan is lucky. Praise is a useful tool. It discourages change. What they didn't see were the private corrections. The way Margaret would ask Ethan a question I'd already answered, just to hear it phrased differently. The way Ethan would repeat her words back to me later, as if they were his own concerns. "She feels like you're distant," he'd say. Distance became the accusation for everything. Tiredness, silence, boundaries I didn't yet know how to name. I tried explaining once, carefully. I said I felt like I was losing my place in my own marriage. Ethan listened, nodded, and then reminded me that his mother had lost her mobility. The comparison ended the conversation. By the fourth year, my silence had become expected. It kept things smooth. That was the justification. Smoothness was valued above accuracy, above fairness, above truth. I told myself this was temporary, that once Margaret stabilized, once Ethan felt less pressure, things would rebalance. That was the story I lived inside. But stories like that require one person to stay quiet indefinitely, and quietly, without anyone announcing it, that person had become me. I didn't realize how deeply that role had settled until the night Ethan accused me of not being built for family, and no one questioned it. Looking back, the warning signs weren't dramatic. They were administrative, procedural, the slow transfer of responsibility without authority, the way my name appeared on documents while decisions happened elsewhere. That was the toxic normalcy. Nothing explosive, nothing that demanded escape, just a steady narrowing of space. And for a long time, I accepted it not because it was right, but because it was familiar. The trigger wasn't dramatic, that's important. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that blends into every other weekday if you don't mark it. I was at my desk at work when a notification appeared on my phone, an overdraft alert tied to our joint account. That hadn't happened before. I opened the banking app and scanned the recent transactions. The amounts weren't enormous, but they were unfamiliar. Repeated charges from a medical supply company I didn't recognize, 3 payments in the same week. I did what I'd always done. I gathered information before reacting. During my lunch break, I called the bank. The representative confirmed the charges had been authorized online. My name was listed as the approving party. That part made me pause. I hadn't approved anything. I asked for copies of the transaction records. She said she could email them to me. She also mentioned, casually, that the vendor had recently updated its billing frequency. That mattered. That evening, I brought it up to Ethan. Not accusing, not emotional, just factual. "I noticed some new charges," I said. "Do you know what they're for?" He didn't look up from his phone. "Probably Mom's supplies." I didn't recognize the vendor. He sighed, already tired of the conversation. "They changed companies. It happens." I wasn't told. He looked at me then. Not angry. Defensive? "Why are you making this a problem?" That question shifted something. I explained the overdraft, the frequency, the authorization in my name. I kept my voice level. I chose my words carefully. Ethan listened, then stood and walked toward the hallway. "Mom," he called out. "Claire's worried about the money again." Again. Margaret rolled into the doorway. She didn't ask what the issue was. She addressed the tone. "I thought we were past this," she said. "My care isn't optional." 8 was know that. "I'm not saying it is," I replied. She nodded slowly, the way people do when they're humoring a child. It just hurts when support comes with conditions. That wasn't what I'd said, but the framing worked. Ethan crossed his arms. "Do you know how stressful it is for her to feel questioned in her own home? Our home." I realized then how easily concern had been converted into accusation. How quickly the conversation had stopped being about money and become about my character. Later that night, Ethan told his sister. By morning, his aunt knew. By the weekend, the story had spread through the family in a softened but sharpened version. I was uncomfortable supporting a disabled woman. I was focused on money. I was changing. At Sunday brunch, someone asked if I was doing okay. Not kindly, carefully. Margaret didn't need to say anything. The misunderstanding did the work for her. Pressure followed. Ethan asked me to apologize. Not for the concern, for the discomfort it caused. "Just reassure her," he said. "She needs to feel secure." I considered it. I really did. Apologies had kept the peace before. But something had shifted. The bank records were still open on my laptop. The authorizations in my name were still unexplained. So instead of apologizing, I asked a simple question. Why was my name used? Ethan's response was immediate. "Don't do this." "Do what?" "Turn this into something it's not." And Anna. Margaret stopped speaking to me after that. Not openly, strategically. She spoke around me. Through Ethan. Through caregivers. Silence. Directed. If you've ever been on the receiving end of that kind of pressure, you know it's meant to teach you a lesson. It almost worked. But then, the documents arrived. An email from the bank. Attached PDFs. Time-stamped authorizations. IP addresses. A note indicating that changes had been made to the account access permissions 2 months earlier. Without my request. Without my consent. That was the moment the misunderstanding stopped being gullible and started being useful to them. They had assumed I would absorb it, that I would retreat, that I would apologize and move on. Instead, I printed the documents and placed them in a folder. A new one. Labeled by hand. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't explain myself. I just stopped absorbing the pressure. And quietly, without announcing it, I began paying attention to everything. I didn't wake up one morning feeling empowered. What changed wasn't my confidence. It was my behavior. I stopped explaining myself. That decision happened quietly, somewhere between printing those bank records and realizing no one had asked how my name ended up on them. I noticed how often my words were used not to understand me, but to reshape the story. So I removed them. At breakfast, Ethan talked. I listened. When he asked why I was quiet, I said I was tired. That was true enough. Margaret resumed speaking to me indirectly, giving instructions through the caregiver while I stood in the room. I followed them without comment. Compliance, when paired with observation, is revealing. I began documenting, not emotionally, administratively. I created a digital folder and backed it up to a private drive. Inside it, I organized files by category: banking, insurance, medical correspondence, household expenses. I downloaded statements going back 3 years. I highlighted patterns. I noted dates. I didn't need proof of betrayal. I needed clarity. I also stopped managing what wasn't formally assigned to me. I paid the bills listed under my name. I left the rest untouched. When caregivers asked about scheduling, I redirected them to Ethan. "No one told me to stop," he said one night. "No one told me to continue," I replied. That was the first time I used silence as a boundary. The house changed after that, not loudly, subtly. Meals came later. Appointments were missed. Small inefficiencies surfaced, things my presence had smoothed over for years. Ethan noticed. He grew tense, not angry, uncertain. "You're different," he said one evening. I nodded. That was all. Margaret sensed the shift too. She called me into the living room one afternoon. She smiled when I entered. That was new. "I feel like there's distance between us," she said. I waited. "You used to care more." There it was. The accusation without detail. Designed to draw defense. "I still care," I said. "I'm just being careful." "Careful about what?" "Responsibility." She studied me. Her eyes were sharp. She had built her authority on fragility, but she wasn't fragile in that moment. Ethan entered mid-conversation. Margaret repeated my word responsibility with a different emphasis. He looked at me like I'd said something threatening. "I'm not fighting," I said calmly. "I'm adjusting." That word unsettled them. Adjusting implied permanence. The real turning point came a week later, when a letter arrived from an insurance provider. It was addressed to me. The subject line referenced a policy modification I hadn't requested. I called the provider directly. The representative confirmed the change had been submitted through an online portal, again under my credentials. I asked for the audit trail. That was when the tone shifted from customer service to procedure. She explained my options: fraud inquiry, account freeze, documentation requirements. I thanked her. I took notes. That night, I didn't mention the letter. I didn't need to. Instead, I opened a new document and began drafting a timeline, not a story, a sequence of facts, dates, amounts, access points. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I was preparing for autonomy. If you've never done this, if you've never stepped back from a dynamic without announcing it, you might not realize how powerful it is. People who rely on your participation panic when it becomes unpredictable. Ethan asked me what I was doing at my laptop. "Organizing," I said. He watched me longer than necessary. "You don't have to do everything alone." I met his eyes. I already was. That ended the conversation. From that moment on, the power shifted, not because I took it, but because I stopped lending it. I no longer absorbed blame. I no longer smoothed over discomfort. I responded only to what was documented, assigned, or mine. Margaret grew quieter. Ethan grew restless. The house lost its rhythm. And in that stillness, the truth began to surface clearly enough for anyone willing to look. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It assembled itself. Piece by piece, document by document, it formed a shape I couldn't ignore anymore. The insurance audit trail came first, then the banking logs, then a series of email confirmations I'd never opened because I'd never received them. The recovery process exposed something simple and unsettling. My credentials had been used consistently, confidently, and without hesitation, by someone who assumed I wouldn't look. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer. Not a dramatic one. A 30-minute review. I brought my folder. I didn't editorialize. I let the paperwork speak. He flipped through the documents, nodded occasionally, and then stopped at the timeline. "Did you authorize these transactions?" he asked. "No." "Did you delegate access?" "No." He leaned back. "Then you have exposure." That word landed cleanly. Exposure. not betrayal, not hurt, risk. He explained liability, joint accounts, implied consent. He also explained remedies, notices, freezes, formal inquiries. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want my name removed from anything I didn't approve," I said. "And I want the record corrected." He nodded. "Then we start with documentation." That same week, I submitted a fraud inquiry to the bank and requested a temporary account freeze pending review. I notified the insurance provider of unauthorized changes and requested a rollback. All of it was done in writing. When the first notice arrived at the house official letterhead, neutral language, Ethan noticed. "What is this?" he asked, holding the envelope like it might explain itself. "A notice," I said. "About what?" "About access." Margaret wheeled in from the hallway. She didn't look confused. She looked alert. Ethan read aloud the first line. His voice slowed. "Pending investigation." He stopped. "What investigation?" I sat down. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand. "One I didn't start," I said. "But I didn't stop." Margaret spoke then. "This is unnecessary. Inter 25 to I." "That may be," I replied. "But it's required." The caregiver lingered near the doorway. Ethan's sister arrived unexpectedly, summoned by tone rather than words. The room filled with people who had assumed I would never escalate. "What are you accusing us of?" Ethan asked. "I'm not accusing anyone," I said. "I'm responding to records." I slid copies of the documents across the table. Not dramatically, neatly, stacked. Timestamps, authorization logs, policy change confirmations. Margaret didn't reach for them. Ethan did. His face changed as he read. Confusion gave way to calculation. "You knew about this?" he asked his mother. She looked at him. I thought Claire understood. Understood what? That my name was a tool? The collapse wasn't loud. It was procedural. Ethan tried to explain. To contextualize. He used phrases like temporary, necessary. For her care. Margaret emphasized urgency, vulnerability. The lawyer's words came back to me. Liability doesn't care about intention. "I'm stepping away from all financial management effective immediately," I said. "Anything moving forward needs to be authorized directly." Ethan shook his head. "You can't just—" "I can," I said. "And I have." The bank confirmed the freeze the next morning. Automatic payments paused. Notifications followed. Care services requested clarification. The narrative shifted. Suddenly, the family wasn't discussing my lack of support. They were discussing logistics. That's what truth does. It reroutes the conversation. Margaret accused me of cruelty. Not directly. Through implication. "You know what this stress does to me," she said. "I know what unapproved liability does to me," I replied. No shouting, no tears, just boundaries. "Ethan asked me to undo it, to fix it." "I already did," I said, "by making it accurate." Snarl tapid, the false power, the kind built on assumption and silence, collapsed in front of witnesses who had never questioned it before. And for the first time, no one asked me to apologize. They asked me to explain. I didn't. The house went quiet after that. Not the comfortable kind, the careful kind. Ethan stopped confronting me and started negotiating. That shift told me everything. He framed it as concern, as repair, as a desire to lower the temperature. Those were his words. "We don't need to make this bigger than it is," he said one evening. "Families handle things internally." I was folding laundry. I didn't stop. "This is internal," I replied. "It's just documented now." Margaret took a different approach. She asked for meetings, not directly with me, with Ethan present. Always a witness, always a tone of reconciliation. "I don't want tension," she said. "I want peace." Peace, I'd learned, often meant compliance. "I'm not holding tension," I said. "I'm holding boundaries." That word made them uncomfortable. Boundaries imply permanence. They imply consequence. Extended family began calling, carefully, indirectly. No one asked what had happened. They asked how we could all move forward. Ethan suggested a compromise. My name could stay on the accounts, but he would check in before changes. Margaret would communicate more clearly. No, I said. He looked at me, startled. Not by the refusal but by the lack of explanation. You're not even willing to discuss it? There's nothing to discuss, I said. The structure failed. I exited it. Margaret accused me of punishing her. I'm removing myself from liability, I said. That's not punishment. That's accuracy. She stared at me longer than she ever had before. Not wounded. Assessing. The lawyer sent follow-up notices. The bank required new authorizations. The insurance provider requested direct confirmation from Ethan. Systems replaced assumptions. That's when the real consequences surfaced. Appointments had to be rescheduled. Paperwork stalled. Ethan missed deadlines I'd quietly managed for years. Caregivers called him instead of me. He was overwhelmed. He said so. Repeatedly. You were good at this, he said one night. I was responsible for it, I replied. There's a difference. They tried guilt. They tried fatigue. They tried nostalgia. Nothing worked. Because I wasn't angry. I wasn't retaliating. I was simply unavailable for the role they needed me to play. One afternoon, Ethan asked if I would reconsider for his sake. I looked at him. Really looked. He wasn't asking me to return to the marriage. He was asking me to restore the system. No, I said. I won't compromise my name again. That ended it. From that point on, every interaction shifted. Shorter sentences, fewer expectations, clearer limits. They began adjusting without me. And I began preparing to leave, not dramatically, not suddenly, but decisively. For the first time in years, the calm in my life was real. I didn't announce my decision to leave. I finalized it. The lease on the house was in Ethan's name. That simplified things. I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer, signed the necessary documents, and arranged for my name to be removed from shared utilities and services. Each step was small. Together, they were irreversible. I packed slowly. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted nothing rushed, nothing forgotten. Objects have a way of carrying history. I only kept what was mine. Ethan noticed the boxes after the third day. You're moving? He asked. Yes. That was all. He stood in the doorway like he was waiting for a longer sentence. It never came. Margaret didn't speak to me at first. Then, on my last evening in the house, she asked to see me alone. Ethan hovered nearby. I asked him to give us a minute. She looked smaller without an audience. Not helpless, just unguarded. I never meant to push you out, she said. I believed she believed that. I know, I replied. You just didn't make space. She nodded once. Ethan needs support. So do I said. That was the entire conversation. No apology. No forgiveness scene. Just acknowledgement. Ethan tried again the next morning. Not to stop me, but to renegotiate. We could do this differently, he said. You don't have to go. One body is indoors. I zipped my suitcase and stood. I already left, I said. This is just the exit. He watched me carry the bags to my car. He didn't help. He didn't block the door. At the threshold, he said my name, not sharply, not softly, like he was testing if it still had weight. I turned. Take care, I said. I meant it. Driving away, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. That mattered. Some departures are about escape. This one was about accuracy. I was leaving a role I'd outgrown, a narrative that required me to be smaller than I was. In the weeks that followed, communication was minimal, necessary, formal, no late-night messages, no emotional appeals. The absence spoke for itself. I didn't monitor how they adjusted. I didn't need to. My life had narrowed into something manageable. Quiet mornings, predictable expenses, my name, finally, attached only to things I'd chosen. If you've ever wondered what strength feels like without adrenaline, this is it. Calm, directional, unapologetic. I didn't look back. Not because I was bitter, but because there was nothing left to explain. Karma didn't arrive with drama. It unfolded the way consequences usually do, quietly, and without commentary. After I left, the systems I'd stepped out of began demanding attention. Bills didn't organize themselves. Appointments didn't align automatically. Forms weren't submitted on time. None of it was catastrophic. That was the point. Ethan learned the difference between presence and participation. Care providers began contacting him directly. Insurance representatives requested clarifications he couldn't answer immediately. The bank required in-person verification for changes that had once been handled online. He told me later briefly, factually, that things were more complicated now. I acknowledged the message. I didn't respond to it. Margaret's influence narrowed. Without my name buffering decisions, her requests were evaluated instead of assumed. Systems asked questions she wasn't used to answering. She was still cared for, still supported, but the leverage had changed. The family adjusted their language. Slowly, where I'd once been described as difficult, I became private. Where I'd been distant, I was now independent. Those revisions told me enough. The most telling outcome wasn't their inconvenience. It was the absence of a replacement. No one stepped seamlessly into the role I'd held, not because it was impossible, but because it required sustained, invisible labor without authority. That realization settled in quietly. Ethan stopped reaching out altogether after a few months, not in anger, in resignation. The marriage, stripped of the structure I'd maintained, had nothing left to lean on. Margaret never contacted me again. I heard through others that she spoke of me with a kind of distant respect. Not warmth, recognition. I didn't need more than that. Karma, I learned, doesn't humiliate. It clarifies. It reveals who depended on what, and who was mistaken about their importance. I didn't celebrate any of it. I didn't track updates. I didn't wait for collapse. I had my own life to attend to. The quiet was stable, the boundaries held. My name stayed clean. That was enough. My life didn't transform overnight. It simplified. I moved into a smaller place across town. Nothing dramatic. Neutral walls, morning light that reached the kitchen table. A lease in my name alone. The first night there, I slept without waking to listen for anyone else's needs. That felt new. I rebuilt my routines deliberately. Work, exercise, quiet dinners. I reconnected with people I'd kept at a distance without realizing it. Not everyone returned. That was fine. The ones who didn't need explanations. I learned what my days looked like without constant correction, without anticipating moods, without preparing defenses that were never used. The absence of that mental labor changed everything. Months later, I ran into Ethan at a grocery store. By accident. A narrow aisle, canned soup between us. He looked older, not worse, just worn in a way I didn't recognize. "Hi," he said. "Hi." We stood there for a moment. No tension, no nostalgia. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm well," I said. It was true. He nodded. "Good." He didn't ask me anything else. I didn't either. When he walked away, I didn't feel relief or sadness, just closure. Margaret passed through my thoughts less often. When she did, it wasn't with anger, it was with clarity. I understood her now not as a villain, but as someone who mistook dependence for authority. I no longer felt the need to correct that misunderstanding. The most important change wasn't external, it was internal. I trusted my perception again. I no longer second-guessed discomfort. I no longer explained boundaries. I treated documentation as protection, not accusation. I understood that calm refusal is sometimes the strongest response available. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in any part of it, the silence, the slow erosion, the moment where clarity replaces hope, know this: you don't need chaos to leave something that no longer fits. You just need accuracy. Today, my relationships are quieter, healthier, mutual. I choose them, and they choose me without negotiation. And that's how I know I was never unwanted. I was just in the wrong place. If this story stayed with you, you're welcome to like and subscribe. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And if you're listening from somewhere right now, tell me which city you're in. I read every comment.